Everyone, so now that we've seen how the active concept works, we can use this for all kinds of stuff. And one very common effect is that the ground breaks open and stuff falls in. Relatively simple with the knowledge we have now. So let's quickly create a simple example for this. So let's say this grid here that we make a bit more interesting with a mountain node, maybe something like that. So it's not completely boring. And then we poly extrude it so that it has a little bit of thickness. And remember, whenever you do that, to turn on the output back in the poly extrude. And then we want to break this up. We could do this with an RBD material fracture, but in this case, because it's relatively thin, a Voronov fracture will do. So we don't need super complex breakups, and a couple of points should be fine, maybe 200 or something, a little less. Well, actually, let's turn this off to get more variation. And here are our pieces. There you go. And now let's think about, we can increase the number, by the way, later. And now let's put this into an RBD bullet solver. And when we press start, this should fall down. Yep. And as usual, I start with 1001. So first of all, let's assemble this whole thing because it will make it easier to work with the active attribute. So we can overwrite the current name. If we wanted to keep the name from the Voronov fracture, then we just turn off create name attribute. But in this case, it's the same. It makes no difference and it doesn't matter. And what we want to try first is to deactivate all pieces, and I call this active 0. And as we know, the attribute we're talking about is an integer, and we set it to 0 to turn all the pieces off. And if we did it right, nothing should happen, and nothing happens. Great. So now we just have to activate the stuff, and we use a group here again. And this time, very simple, we simply use, first of all, let's call this active group. And let's make sure it's a point group. It would work with primitives as well, because a packed geometry is always a primitive and a point at the same time. But I prefer using point groups when I work with packed geometry. And what I want is, a hole, so it should be round. So we take a bounding sphere. And the trick now really is quite simple. We just animate the scale of that thing. We start with a relatively small scale. And then let's say in roughly 2 seconds, more or less, this thing should grow and cover more pieces. There you go. And what should we do with this group? Of course, we want to activate all the pieces inside of that group. So let's choose the group first, and then simply activate the pieces with active equals 1. And as you can see, it was super quick to simulate. So if we run this again, it looks like this. It starts in the middle and then it breaks outside. So relatively straightforward, but looks pretty cool, and especially looks cool when you have more pieces. So let's increase our pieces now again, maybe to 1000. And there's nothing new here really. The only difference here is that we didn't animate the translation of a group, but we simply scaled it up. And of course you can use multiple objects as an input here that are scaling in different speeds and all that. There's so many options here, but it helps to understand how relatively straightforward an effect like this is. And you should definitely try it yourself and then come up with some cool ideas what you can do with this. So as you can see, a pretty cool effect. And if you put a little bit more effort into this, then you can use this on more complex scenery. The only thing you have to be careful about is that everything that you pack needs to have its own proper name attribute. So for example, here the surface and the lower part that I also created, they have their own name, surface and underground. So this is all coming from 2 assembles, of course. And no, it's actually 2 Voronov fractures. And by the way, here I cached this because it actually took quite a while to break this thing up here. So like we talked about before, it sometimes makes sense to cache this out. And then I did the same with other stuff like the buildings. And again, they get their own name attribute. Be careful when you have 2 buildings that both have a different prefix, so that not accidentally you'd pack the geometry with one name and then use it again. Otherwise you will have the same name attribute. Can be a little bit annoying, but just be careful that every single piece has a unique name attribute. Very important, otherwise it doesn't work. And here the same for the cars. And here I solved this by copying the cars first and then use an assemble. And in this case, the trick was actually that I packed them before. So each car was defined by a single point anyway. And then I used the assemble to take the packed versions of the car and only create a new name attribute. I did not pack with the assemble. So many different approaches to creating separate unique name attributes. Let me quickly show you how it looks like when your name attribute is clashing. It looks like this, and we've seen this before, that pieces are flying around like crazy. And even though it looks kind of interesting, that's not what we wanted. And what's happening here is simple. The transformation of an object is moved over to another object with the same name where the transformation doesn't make sense. So if you see something like that, then it's probably a name clashing and two pieces or more have the same name, and this is what then happens. Okay, and if I bring all of this together and have my group here that is animated like this, then the whole thing looked pretty cool in the beginning. So you can see here it breaks into pieces, and we will look at it in a real time in a second. And first it looked great, but then unfortunately I didn't realize that I have to activate the buildings as well, and then it can happen that some pieces just float in the air. To solve this, I had to adjust my setup a little bit so that after the first activation the group gets bigger to cover everything that should be activated. It will be easier to do this later on when we look at constraints, but for now all we want to work with is the simple but very powerful concept of activating pieces. And here you can see now the buildings later on will be activated as well. And when we look at the final result, it looks like this. And you can see, even without constraints, even without super complex setups, a simple activation can create an effect like this. Sure, it will look better later when the buildings are not just collapsing without any resistance. So it looks a bit funny in the end. And this is something we'll look at later, but it's all about the concept. So give it a try and build your own version of this. And as you can see, it's not too complicated, but a pretty nice effect nonetheless. So I hope this is helpful as an example. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.